There was a time when in prisoner of war camps, Americans were dying at the rate of 50 a day. This Sunday night, NBC Reports is showing at 7 o'clock Eastern Time a special program called Bataan, The Forgotten Hell. It details the infamous death march and what happened to the prisoners. Here are some scenes from it, and we'll recall two men who survived.
We were all frightened. We didn't know what to expect. We had heard that the Japanese had been very cruel, and yet I had hope that they would abide by the rules of the Geneva Convention, just an outside hope. And you felt so lost and hopeless, and you knew you were defeated, and you were at their mercy.
Men too weak to defend themselves were made to march in the heat of the Philippine summer, most of the 90 miles to O'Donnell prison camp. There were no rations. There was no water.
They took the weak ones, and most of these that I saw were Filipinos that were really very weak. They didn't wait for them to die. They just hit them with shovels, and they dug a mass grave and had other troops, American troops or Filipino troops, cover them up. And some of them were trying to fight to get out, and then they did either hit them with a shovel or bang at them.
Those two men are with us today. Lloyd Mills, who was a captain in the 57th Infantry, and Manny Lawton, who was also a captain, advisor to the Philippine Army. They were 23 years old at the time. Lloyd Dobbins, by the way, was the reporter. It is an incredible documentary, thanks to you gentlemen. The Death March was just the beginning, though. That's what we remember from the movies and so forth. How long from the Death March to your liberation?
3.5 years.
3.5 years? And yet you feel that the Death March itself was not the worst of it.
No. The Death March was a cakewalk compared to the prison ship trip to Japan.
Which happened 2 years later.
Yes, 47 days of travel from start to finish.
In the hold?
In the holds of
what
cargo
happened
ships.
In the hold?
Well, to begin with, you know, Manila or the Philippines has very hot climate. And imagine the sun bearing down on the steel sides of the ship. It made it feel like 120 degrees in there. I'm sure it must have been. And we were so crowded, there was no space to lie down. People drank their water almost immediately, their canteen of water, and got no more.
And were killing each other for water.
And when night came on, it was as dark as you can imagine, just pitch dark. And people panicked for water, for air, and went crazy. Some numbers of them lost their minds. And that first night, some became vampires and tried to cut others to drink their blood. This happened. I know some that it happened to.
Lloyd, how many of you were alive when the prison ship trip was over?
Well, actually, I think the 45-day trip was probably worse than all 1,248 days that I spent as a prisoner. And particularly on the second ship at Takao Formosa. Unfortunately, I was in the forward hole, which got a direct hit. There were 500 of us in that hole. About 100 came out alive. The Japanese kept us there for 3 days, and I recall seeing friends of mine with their heads blown off, arms, legs, screaming for help, but we had no way to help them. And the Japanese kept us there for 3 days with the dead, and finally they put nets down, and we had to load the dead bodies up. And everybody was wounded one way or the other. And then the third ship, when we got into Moji, actually there were only approximately 400 of us left alive out of 1,600, and I think, to me, that was probably my lowest point.
You see, so many got pneumonia. When we left Formosa and got toward Japan, it was January, and we buried 25 a day over the side, mostly with pneumonia.
Are there 23-year-old men inside you that still suffer over this?
Well, when I first got back, I would say yes, but then as the years went by, I tried to forget that. And then it all came back when I was in the Philippines this year. I went back, and I met Daryl Murray and, of course, Jane Wilson, and they seemed to be so sincere in wanting to find out what happened. So I was able to tell them, which I'd kept into me inside all these years.
Manny, you say in the documentary that at one point you cried, or which proved to you, perhaps it was you, Lloyd? One of you. It was you, Manny? That it proved to you that you were still human.
Right.
Are you crying now? Do you often relive?
No. Fortunately, I've been able to throw it off completely. It's never bothered me emotionally. Well, of course, I get sentimental and a little emotional on certain subjects, but it's never been a problem for me, and I feel very fortunate for that.
You didn't talk about it for 25 years? Why not?
Well, I figured nobody would believe these things, you know. They were so unreal.
Nobody was interested, actually, I thought.
Your immediate family, yes.
What do you want people to know about it now?
Well, I think that probably the time has come that people should know what people had to go through to survive.
Sunday night at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, Lloyd Dobbins presents Bataan, the Forgotten Hell. And it is perhaps one of the most moving hours of television you'll see in a long time. We'll be back after station break.
It was hell. If there ever was hell, it was here. They fired until the breech froze on the gun.
But we were nothing but animals trying to survive.
Unless you live through these experiences, there's no way in God's green earth that they could understand it.
Hello again. This is Jack Benny coming to you. I'll be home by Christmas Eve. I'll be home by Christmas.
40 years ago, Leonard Dugan was a teenage PFC in the Army, nicknamed Dixie. He and his friends lived in this barracks. Dixie Dugan did something most of them did not. He survived. He survived the siege, the battle, the prisoner of war camps. 40 years later, Dixie Dugan came back for a reunion with fellow survivors.
I had to come back and see it myself, and it was touching. It really was. Because I lost some good buddies here, but I can't even remember some of their names, and that hurts me most, I think. Because there were some good soldiers in this outfit.
December 1941. Japan went to war. They needed oil and power. They called it Asia for the Asians. The Japanese seemed invincible. The white colonial masters were beaten into submission. Japanese forces consumed the enemy. Except here, the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island in the Philippines. American and Filipino troops, all of them poorly equipped, most of them poorly trained, were supposed to crumble in 30 days. They held for 5 months. They fought when they were hungry, thirsty, exhausted, and held help was coming.
American and Filipino troops fighting in the jungles along a 200-mile defense arc are reported making a grim last-ditch stand. All available forces have now been united.
The 80,000 troops on that defensive arc had been driven back to the Bataan Peninsula as the Japanese took control of the main Philippine island of Luzon. The 1942 radio report did not say that 80,000 men now existed in a steamy, malaria-infested jungle with little food, water, or medicine, and were fighting with their backs to the wall. Using World War I weapons, they fought the most modern war machine in the Pacific, with predictable results. But they were only holding on. Help was on the way. Washington had promised it any day now. Their fighting spirit was fed only by rumor.
Everybody believed it. Rumor fed on rumor. And when men are desperate, they will believe almost anything. They talk about a 100-mile convoy of ships that was on the way from the United States to the Philippines. And that pretty soon it would arrive, and the Japanese enemy would just melt away.
No help was on the way. President Roosevelt and his advisors had decided to fight the war in Europe first. But the troops here believed. Every day they watched the horizon for the help that would never come because it was never sent. The people here had hope, but that's all they had.
Over and over again, while in that foxhole, that young man would realize that grenades that they gave him, only 2 grenades out of 25 went off. This was 1918 ammunition. The Japanese mortars went every single time. They worked. The boys would slowly get the idea, and it was true, that they were the abandoned Americans. The abandoned Americans.
The troops were on their own. There weren't going to be any reinforcements. There weren't going to be any supplies. Rations were cut to half, then to a third. The men ate what they could find. First the cavalry's horses, then the quartermaster's mules, then water buffalo, monkey, snake, lizard, whatever they could find, but it wasn't enough.
Oh, yeah, see, we ate up the cavalry. We'd laugh and joke about it. Now we've eaten the cavalry. What are we going to do next?
Next, they got sick. Exhausted, hungry men in 100-degree temperatures without medical help. More men died of disease than were killed in battle. Many more. The Americans and Filipinos held on. February 8, 1942, 2 months after he landed, General Masahari Homa called off the attack. He had lost 7,000 men. The Japanese pulled back to wait for reinforcements, battle-hardened veterans from the victory at Singapore. The Americans just waited. March 11th, General MacArthur was ordered to Australia, and General Jonathan Wainwright took command of what was left. Headquarters was on Corregidor Island. In the worst of it, General Wainwright went from position to position talking to his men. When his aides insisted that he take cover from the constant enemy fire, he refused. He said he had nothing left to give his men. He had no food, no water, no ammunition, no equipment, no supplies. All he had left was morale. Just morale. General Homa could have starved the defenders into submission, but Tokyo's orders were to destroy them in combat. to demonstrate Asian superiority. His reinforced troops got ready. "45 days after the attack stopped, General Homer's troops were ready. It was April 3rd, 1942, Good Friday. The Japanese wanted the high ground at Mount Summit. They got it.
The men were utterly exhausted from a shortage of food, from daily hunger, from no medicine, no rest, no reinforcements, from bad ammunition, from the filth and the dirt and the dust of Bataan.
It was a nightmare. Cannon fire, screams, banzai, Japanese hollering, Filipinos shooting up there, Americans scared, people praying. It was just fear, just gut fear. I mean, the face of something. It was hell. If there ever was hell, it was here.
We took very serious casualties, and we only was able to stay there one day. We were ordered to fall back to higher ground to the rear, and I had probably less than 60 to 70 men somewhere along there. Lost all my machine guns, we didn't have any ammunition. Very, very black night for me and everybody, actually.
From Australia, General MacArthur ordered a counterattack against Mount Summit. There is disagreement about whether General MacArthur knew the true condition of the troops on Bataan. They were wounded, exhausted, diseased. No one knows how many died trying to get there, unable to survive this last effort.
Well, it was a brutal thing. I was in the Air Corps, and I didn't know anything about bayonet fighting. And we learned, though, the hard way, the cruel way. And we finally did fight our way back and try to get some sort of organization. We had done our best. We'd held out as long as we could.
The men had nothing left to give. They ran, some fleeing toward the safety of Corregidor Island, 3 miles across Manila Bay. From Corregidor, General Wainwright radioed Washington. Bataan has fallen. It was April 9th, 1942. 76,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to the Japanese in the largest single capitulation in American history. Some of the men made it to Corregidor. Hundreds of others died trying. Corregidor now is a reminder of Corregidor then. The Japanese bombardment started that first day and never stopped. At first, Corregidor couldn't fire back. They might hit their own men, the prisoners. No one believed Wainwright and his exhausted garrison could stop the Japanese. They could only delay them and make them pay. Wainwright challenged Homer. You want it? Then come take it. Corregidor was the last barrier to Japanese conquest of the Philippines. When it finally ended, It had been so bad, not a single tree stood anywhere on Corregidor. Not a single building remained intact. But for a while, the troops on Corregidor remained free to fight if they could. Not on Bataan. On Bataan, they were prisoners of a brutal army.
Well, we were all frightened. We didn't know what to expect. We had heard that the Japanese had been very cruel, and yet I had hope that they would abide by the rules of the Geneva Convention, just an outside hope. And you felt so lost and hopeless, and you knew you were defeated, and you were at their mercy.
American and Filipino troops who had survived had been herded together here to be marched to Japanese prison camps. They could not have known, but before the trip was over, the trip they were to make would be called the Bataan Death March. What happened here was, in part at least, a clash in cultures. Japanese soldiers had been taught that to die in battle was honor, to surrender was disgrace. So anyone captive had to be something less than worthwhile. The Japanese plan for handling prisoners fell apart. They had captured 3 times as many men as they thought they would, and those men weren't healthy. They were diseased and half-starved. Men too weak to defend themselves were made to march in the heat of the Philippine summer, most of the 90 miles to O'Donnell prison camp. There were no rations. There was no water.
There was 4 of us that stayed together on the entire death march. When one would get weak and wouldn't be able to carry on, we would help him. We'd help carry him.
If you begin to falter and step out, you were shot. And most times you were, I'll retract that, you were not shot. You were bayoneted. They didn't want to waste ammunition on you.
This guy fell down, and he just couldn't get up anymore. This is when I saw this horrible thing this Japanese soldier did. I think he poured kerosene on his uniform and set this guy on fire. We looked at him, we couldn't stop, but he was just screaming. He was in pain, and there's nothing any one of us could do.
And the dead were a constant stream of dead on both sides of the road, our Americans and Filipinos, just lining the ditch from one end of Bataan to the other.
And then it was hot in April. And there was artesian wells all along the way. And, but they wouldn't let you go and have a drink.
And a lot of the men that had dysentery, you know, you become terribly dehydrated. So they become crazed and go for the water, and what the Japanese would do, if they were merciful, they would shoot them. But the Japanese are not merciful people, not these people were anyway. And they would bayonet a lot of them just for trying to get a sip of water.
They took the weak ones, and most of these that I saw were Filipinos that were really very weak. They didn't wait for them to die. They just hit them with shovels, and they dug a mass grave and had the other troops, American troops or Filipino troops, cover them up. And some of them were trying to fight to get out, and then they did either hit them with a shovel or bayonet them. And I'll never forget the Filipino people that braved death, that would slip up to the column and throw banana leaves full of rice at us.
I saw one Filipino child that one gave an American soldier a handout, and he was being beaten by one of the Japanese soldiers. And his mother naturally went to help him rescue him, and they were both killed.
Sheer revenge. They just couldn't accept an Asian people fighting with the white men against Japanese.
The death march began approximately at Mariveles on the bottom of the Bataan Peninsula and went to a town called San Fernando, Pampanga. And there they put us in freight cars.
My God, people had dysentery. There was no place for them to go except on you. And you had very little air to breathe.
And of course the steel side with the sun bearing in there made it feel like an oven, and we were packed so closely together that if anybody fainted or died, he just stayed in place. He couldn't even fall down, you know.
I don't imagine over 80 of us came out of that boxcar. There must have been at least 20 died.
About 10,000 American and Filipino troops died on the Bataan Death March. 10,000. May 4th, 1942, the worst day. 16,000 artillery shells hit Corregidor Island. That's one every 5 seconds for 24 hours. Survivors said it felt like one continuous earthquake. The last big gun, Battery Gary, was destroyed. This was the last safety on Corregidor, Malenta Tunnel, 836 feet long, 24 feet wide. It has 26 side tunnels. At one time toward the end, there were 4,000 people packed in here, soldiers and civilians. Some of them men, their courage gone, terrified of going back outside in the unending war. They preferred to breathe dust, listen to the screams of the wounded, smell the stink of the dying, occasionally kill or wound themselves. Anything just so they wouldn't have to go back under the Japanese siege guns. The men outside hated them, called them tunnel rats. There were 1,000 others in here they did not hate. They were the wounded. They were in one of the side tunnels, the hospital tunnel. It was filled to capacity and beyond.
You were more or less petrified because of the constant bombing and shelling and just doing your job because it had to be done. I believe we fired 144 rounds. To my recollection, we fired until the breech froze on the gun.
It looked like all hell had broken loose, and it had. Every gun, every .45 caliber pistol was being fired. Well, I'll never forget that. It was like 4th of July celebration.
May 5th, 1942. Japanese troops invaded Corregidor. On the island, troops and nurses waited for them to come.
We could hear the gunfire, and of course the men, some of them from the outside, brought the news in immediately that the Japanese were out there and that they would be coming into the tunnel if the surrender didn't take place soon.
This was the scene of one of the more unusual and futile battles of Corregidor. The Japanese had come across Manila Bay, 2,000 troops had landed and were advancing. The American command sent in 500 sailors from the scuttled submarine tender Canopus. They weren't trained for it, didn't know quite how to do it, but they fixed bayonets and charged. Drove the Japanese back 300 yards. But to keep them back, they needed reinforcements and asked for them. None came. What the sailors didn't know was they had been the reinforcements. Japanese troops closed in on Malenta Tunnel. Linta Tunnel, General Wainwright radioed President Roosevelt. With broken heart and head bowed in sadness, but not in shame, I go to meet the enemy. To save his men from slaughter, Wainwright surrendered to Homa.
Homa was a rather arrogant, austere man, a big silent individual with an occasional grunt, which meant either yes or no, whichever his underlings interpreted.
Captain Thomas Dooley, General Wainwright's wartime aide, was with him at the surrender.
General Wainwright was very depressed. He had undergone this surrender, and he could just picture in his own mind that he was in disgrace, because he was the first American he could think of that had surrendered a force of that size and under those circumstances.
I'll never forget the time I saw the first Japanese. Right after the surrender, I was working in the operating room, and I happened to look up, and I saw a Japanese standing in the entrance of the operating room. And that was the time I realized it was over.
A lot of my friends gone. Many of those boys are gone that were with me. They were kids, they were babies, 16, 17 years of age. 40 years has passed, I'm still here. Sometimes I have a guilty feeling. I think most of us feel that we should have stayed out here and never surrendered. But our command surrendered us. They put up the white flag. We would have gone to the death if we had to.
Troops from Corregidor joined the Death March survivors in prison camps like O'Donnell. Each water spigot was shared by 1,500 men. Each fish head by 10. Any rat they could catch was a meal for 20. And if they got sick, they died. Some just gave up and died.
You will bow to every Japanese soldier, private or officer, you will bow and salute him. This was the way we were greeted.
Manny Lawton, who had hoped the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners would be obeyed, learned immediately that it would not be. The Japanese refused to recognize the Western concept of honorable surrender.
We had to stand for at least an hour while a little squatty Japanese sat up on a platform there and shouted at us and told us that we were not prisoners of war, that we were captives. He degraded us in saying that the Japanese soldier never surrendered.
And he let us know that we were at the bottom of the totem pole in this world, that we were nothing. There was no medicine. We had our doctors, but they didn't have any medicine for us. And they designated one building as a hospital, but they only put them there to die. When I got within 100 yards of that place, I could smell it. I could smell the filth, and I could smell the death.
If you got sick and you were sent into the hospital, they didn't increase your food or give you medicine to build you back up where you could go back to work. They cut your rations. So you fought not to get into the hospital. And many times I've gone out on work details with a temperature of 106 or higher, because I knew that if I went into the hospital, I would die.
You know, dying to some of these people was just, you know, boy, getting out of this. It was a way of getting out.
During the first few weeks at O'Donnell, 50 American prisoners died every day. so did 500 Filipinos.
Survival is a hell of a thing in a man, and everybody wants to survive. And that's the point that I was always thinking about. If there was one son of a bitch that was going to come out of this thing, it was going to be me.
You had to fight with every fiber, every minute, every hour, every day, to struggle to stay alive.
Staying alive meant getting more food, buy it, trade or gamble for it, steal it from the Japanese, or, when all else failed, from each other. Not all you wanted, just enough to live. 4 months after they were captured, the Filipinos were released. 27,000 had died at Camp O'Donnell. By the end of 1942, 5,000 Americans had died in Philippine prison camps. For some, the best chance to survive seemed to be escape. But that meant others would die. Prisoners watched each other because for everyone who escaped, the Japanese executed 10 who remained behind. Joseph Baxter escaped, fought with the guerrillas, and was recaptured. Under Japanese rules, he should have been beheaded, but the Japanese thought he had secret information. He was put in a dungeon in Manila and tortured.
I lost all track of time, never knowing when they would pull me out of the cell. I could always hear the screams of torture from the other prisoners who were brought to the interrogation rooms. We would often pray that we would maybe stay in for 3 or 4 days without being called out, and I remember that I would pray that maybe they had forgotten me, and I could lay there and die in peace.
The Japanese had heard the rumor that a secret tunnel connected the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. They were convinced that Baxter could tell them about it. He couldn't. It didn't exist. They refused to believe that.
They grabbed my hair and pulled my shoulders back and head back, and the Japanese officer took his cigarette and jammed it into my left eyeball, rolling the cigarette around until it fell into pieces. The excruciating pain forced me to my feet, and I broke free. This was the last I remember, because they beat me into unconsciousness. Many days later after that, I was laying on the floor, and an American officer, a doctor, was working on my eye with some kind of solution. And the pain brought me to, and he said, "Soldier, be still. I'm wiping the maggots from your eye."
In 1944, General Wainwright was shipped to Manchuria. He had been beaten and humiliated, but what depressed him most was his belief that he would someday be court-martialed because he had surrendered. In the Philippines, his men worried about survival and wondered what was going on.
Here I'd been a prisoner over 2 years. And at the time in the Philippines, it was like there was no tomorrow. It was almost the point of giving up. You know, we hadn't heard anything in 2 years. We didn't know anything other than rumors.
August 1944. American bombers hit the Philippines for the first time. It was a fact, not a rumor. With naval guns and General MacArthur pounding at the door, the Japanese sent the prisoners to Japan, slaves of the Japanese war effort. Manny Lawton and Lloyd Mills waited on a sun-baked pier for hours. Then, with 1,600 others, they were packed in the holds of the Oryoku Maru. December 13th, 1944, the ship sails.
It was stifling for lack of air, and it was hot. The fellows who drank up their water immediately started yelling for water. Water, we want water. And the interpreter, Mr. Water, said, "Shut up. If you don't shut up, I will close the hatches and we don't have no water. You'll get no water."
I was trying to control my little canteen of water, and I was even afraid to take a sup out of it, afraid somebody would jump me.
People began to go mad from thirst and from panic.
They were killing each other for a want of water, trying to steal other canteens of water that men had. And some of them went so far as to drink urine. It was almost indescribable to discuss how how a person can turn into an animal, forget that he's a human, actually. That we were nothing but animals, trying to survive, trying to get water to live.
And they became vampires, trying to cut their companions and drink their blood. Now this happened, it happened to a friend of mine. I noticed that his arms were slashed, both arms, not deep cuts, but cuts. And I said, Al, what's happened to you? And he said, well, last night, one of those crazy fellas was trying to cut my arms to drink my blood, and said I fought him off for some time, maybe an hour, and then two fellas next to me realized what was going on. And one of them grabbed him and held him, and the other took his canteen and beat him to death. And he said, that's what saved me.
The next morning, they did open the hatches, and some of the people started up, and they were shot by the Japanese. They were completely mad. They wanted to get out of the hole.
The prison ships, and there were several of them, were not marked. So to an American submarine, they looked like Japanese freighters. About 5,000 American prisoners died in these attacks.
And the next morning, our Navy found us again, our airplanes. They bombed this convoy. There were several ships in the convoy, and they got the other ships, and then they started on us.
The first thing that I thought, my God, hit us. I wanted them to hit us. I wanted to end it right then. I said, I was saying to myself, hit us. Let's get this thing over with.
A bomb made a direct hit, and it killed about 100 to 150 people.
Still near the Philippines, the Japanese abandoned the Oryoku Maru. Prisoners were ordered to swim the 300 yards to shore.
I know we spent Christmas Day on the shore at Lingayen Gulf, hungry, thirsty, discouraged, and you know, just a desolate thing. And you knew that you were going to be sent to Japan. You knew there was no turning back now.
We were issued one rice ball per man. That was our Christmas dinner. And the next morning, we were loaded up on what had been a horse boat or a cattle boat.
And we got then to Formosa. And after several days, we heard a plane coming.
And we were hit by our own planes.
Shrapnel flying. Half of our number dead.
Then it was worse, really, than the Oryoku Maru. You'd look around and there would be somebody standing there minus a head, or sitting there, I'm sorry, minus a head. Others screaming minus a leg or an arm. No medicine, begging for you to do something and help them, and there was nothing you could do. But to stay down there, we were just lost all sense of comprehending anything. Actually, we're there with all these dead bodies, no food, no water, nothing, for 3 days. And we were then transferred to a third ship. About 800 of us left out of the 1,600.
On their third ship, the prisoners who had survived the first two got 2 teaspoons of water and an ounce of rice each day. That was better. The weather was worse.
Very shortly we were in cold waters, and before long we ran into snow, and the deck got iced over, and it was freezing cold in there. Then pneumonia set in after we got to colder climate approaching Japan. We began burying 25 a day over the side. We left Manila with 1,618 prisoners, and we finally got to Japan 45 days later with something less than 400, I think about 375.
I was hardly able to move by that time, and for the first time in all the years, I'd begin to lose my sense of optimistic outlook, and I felt, well, you're just not going to make it, Lloyd. This is going to be it. But by the time I got that feeling, we landed in Moji, and I couldn't walk off the ship. We had some Australians there working on the dock, and one of them carried me off the ship. I'll never forget, they were very friendly and so husky. To me, it looked like a giant, because I only weighed 80 pounds, so he could just pick me up and like I was a baby. And they put me in it. I didn't know it at the time, but they put me in the death barracks.
By early 1945, Japan was being battered from the air. American prisoners were starting their 4th year in captivity.
The Japanese were suffering very, very badly, you know, right at the very end. They were hurting. We would go on short rations, but so did the Japanese.
Prisoners were given just enough food to keep them working, especially in the mines, the most dangerous work of all. Whatever was dangerous or mindless or difficult, the prisoners did, and they suffered for it. The survivors still remember the mines.
There wasn't a day that went by in the coal mine that somebody wasn't hurt. Men lost their legs, had their skulls crushed, had their backs broken. Men would break their arms on purpose rather than go down in the coal mine. The civilians didn't bother us, but as the bombings increased, they would throw stones at us and spit at us.
The bombing raids made the Japanese angry. This was worse. The ashes of Japanese servicemen being brought home in increasing numbers. Hatred for America increased, and the only Americans in Japan were the prisoners. It made survival that much more difficult, but by then, it was largely a matter of luck anyway.
If it hadn't have been for the guy next to me, who was a corpsman, I wouldn't be talking to you now. They brought the rice in, and I told him, I said, would you get my rice for me? He said, no way. He said, I'm not going to take care of you. He said, you're going to be dead tomorrow anyway. He started laughing, and the more he laughed, the madder I got, and I got up and I started walking a little bit more each day. And I got to where I could move around, and I got outside to where I could go to work, and then I started coming back. And this corpsman, he said, you know, if I hadn't gotten you mad, you wouldn't have made it, and I knew it.
Those who had made it this far had paid an awful price. They had lived as animals, worked as slaves. Their bodies were ruined, their minds dulled. They wondered whether, if they did survive and get home, they would ever be human again.
You know, in the outside world, a death of somebody that's close to you affects you very, very strongly. But after you see so many die, and they're dead people, they're corpses all around you, you become hardened to it. And it doesn't bother you, strangely enough. And you have to get hardened to it, or it would upset you terribly. And I guess we sort of all did that. But after we got to Japan, my good friend Henry Leitner developed pneumonia, double pneumonia. Henry just had a very high fever. And I looked up one morning, he was going out the doorway with his canteen cup in his hand, and I called to him and said, Henry, where are you going? He said, man, I'm dehydrated. I've got to have some of that snow. There was about a foot of snow on the ground. And I begged him to come back. I said, Henry, you can't stand that cold. Yeah, he said, I'm burning up. I've just got to cool down. So I guess that aggravated his pneumonia, and that night he died. His death brought me back to reality. While it was a sad, it did one thing for me. It made me realize I could cry.
They said bomb. We thought they meant bombs.
And it destroyed a whole city.
3 days later, Nagasaki got it.
The Emperor has ordered the forces to surrender. The war is over.
The war's over.
We were regaining our freedom. You can't describe it.
Gradually, it got sorted out. Prisoners were sent home. The Japanese were disarmed. The pieces were picked up. The Japanese conquest ended. The surrender papers were signed. It would never be the same, but at least the other side had to do the bowing. And instead of the court-martial General Wainwright had feared all those years, there were cheers. And in Washington, with some of his fellow survivors looking on, General Wainwright got the Congressional Medal of Honor and his 4th star from President Truman. Wainwright and all the others got one thing more: $1 a day for each day as a prisoner. $1.
I had a news reporter interview me on the boat coming back, and he asked me a specific question. Was it really as bad as they had heard? And my only answer to him was that if the truth were ever known and given out, the attitude of the American people is they wouldn't believe it.
How would they possibly know what we went through? There's no way they could. How could I tell them about walking around for 3 years with nothing but a G-string on, and hoping that I could get one handful of rice to survive that one day? And yet what was keeping me alive was the will to live. I wanted to live. I wanted to survive. I wanted to come home. And you can't explain this to people. Unless you live through these experiences, there's no way in God's green earth that they could understand it.
Outside Manila, there is an American military cemetery, the largest one in the Pacific. In the memorial, the names of those killed in the Pacific during World War II are listed. There are 36,000 of them. They are the ones whose bodies were never recovered. World War II is long ago. 42% of Americans today weren't even born when Bataan and Corregidor fell. But if they came here, they might find their family name. Perhaps we ought to remember better than we do, but the world moves on. After the war, we needed the Japanese as allies against the Soviet Union. Japan was rebuilt. We buried our dead, passed out some medals, a little money, and moved on. In Europe during World War II, 1% of the American prisoners died. In the Pacific, 57% died. All of this is history, largely forgotten. All that remains is personal triumph.
about heroes. There's no definition for that. But I think one of the greatest words in the English language is survivor. And that's what we are as survivors.
NBC News produced this program and is responsible for its content.